I'm the executive director for the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative and a senior fellow also. I'm a neurobiologist by training and still an active neuroscientist, both in the classroom, in academic research, but also administratively. And it's really my great pleasure to be partnering with AIIR. It's been an outstanding partnership. I think our communities are really learning from each other. One of the things that I found was the most fascinating when coming to Wharton after spending 14 years at Duke University was really the aspect of bringing academics and practitioners together to really bolster both communities and learn from each other, because I'm a multidisciplinary thinker by heart and trade. And I think that the largest problems can be tackled together and not in isolation. And I think it's time to really bring these communities into dialogue together and learn best practices and challenges and styles of inquiry in order to address them. So it's really great to be here. So I'll pass, my virtual mic down the road and let our outstanding panelists introduce themselves and give you a little bit of background about their own research interests, which I think will help the conversation.
Hello, I'm Vera Ludwig. I just started working with Michael, which I'm really excited about. So I'm also a neuroscientist, psychologist, and my background is mostly in the topic of self-control, self-regulation, and the neural basis of this. And I'm also specialized in contemplative traditions, so I've learned a lot about yoga, philosophy, and these kind of traditions, with the idea that we can maybe use some of the elements from these traditions and implement, and bring them more to the West, like it has also been done with mindfulness, for example, and then to enrich, for example, the coaching environment here. So I've also worked as a coach myself, so I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm really interested in this topic. At the moment now I'm also working at making connections and really studying interventions that can increase connectedness between people, derived from different approaches like nonviolent communication, for example, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, or contemplative traditions, for example. So thank you for having me here.
Hi, my name is Kristin Brethel-Haurwitz. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Penn working with Professor Joe Cable in the psychology department. I have a PhD in psychology from Georgetown and also training in neuroscience. And my area of expertise is empathy and social decision making, and I use functional neuroimaging and also brain stimulation to better understand how the brain networks that Michael was talking about, how that influences how we interact with other individuals and also make decisions. My research now focuses on why we make selfish decisions, but I've also studied altruism, particularly studying altruistic kidney donors.
Hi, I'm Bruce Doré. Sorry about that. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And starting in July, I'll be an assistant professor of marketing and neuroscience at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. So I do work basically on social influence and emotion regulation. And increasingly, I look at not just how people can control their own emotions, but how people can control the emotions of other people that they're interacting with, or even how emotions or other kinds of ideas or even behaviors can spread from person to person or throughout an entire population. And also, I just want to say thank you for having me here. It's great to be part of this, and I'm really excited to contribute to this community where we're focused on bringing behavioral and brain science to bear to these really important coaching, consulting, management problems.
So I think maybe we'll start by addressing one question that I think each of you has a perspective on, including Michael. Maybe actually I'll have Michael start. Not that we haven't heard from him, but let's start with the idea that people's behaviors are rooted in what people value and what motivates them. So I'm hoping that each of you has a perspective there, from the emerging science areas that you each work on, that can sort of direct how we think about value and motivation, and how this is impacting behavior and decision making. And to sort of add on to that, what might be an application of this within the context of coaching?
Well, I mean, I've spent the last 20 years studying how the brain processes value and how that architecture actually drives our decisions. But honestly, I mean, the field has come so far, and that these folks here are doing so much cutting edge research, because it's like, so a lot of my work was aimed at trying to just understand, how does the brain do this? Okay, if I value eating Fritos more than eating an apple, I can decode that from your brain. Okay, but what makes me value Fritos in the first place? And how could somebody like a doctor or a nutritionist get me to value the apple more? That's the more challenging question, I think. And honestly, you guys have better insight into that. So I'm going to pass it along to you to hear from the cutting edge.
Yeah, so I think one theory that we just developed in my previous work in mindfulness at the Mindfulness Lab at Brown University, and which we might expand upon in the future also, is the idea that awareness is really key for changing the value of certain behaviors. So like Michael said, like the question is, okay, if you have some kind of unhealthy behavior, like you know that whenever you're stressed, you're going to shout at your employees or something like this, then how can you like realize that this behavior has a low value so that you will no longer act it out, right? And the idea is that awareness is really important for that, meaning that you basically have to really pay attention to the consequences of your behavior, but it goes a little further than that. It's not just the consequences, like obvious external consequences, like for example, okay, now my employees don't like me as much anymore, etc. But also, how does it feel like to actually act in that way? Because actually many behaviors that are altruistic, that are good, let's say that are connecting, feel rewarding. They basically have a high reward value. So in a way, all we have to do is to pay really attention to that. And all these kind of desirable things like being curious in the workplace, exploring, these things also activate the dopaminergic system, so they are rewarding in themselves. So we have to just pay attention. And of course, also a safe environment has to be in place. Like we all know, if we are every day scared that we will lose our job or something like this, then all these processes can anyway not take place. So I think these would be some starting points, how we can change value in the brain. And maybe one further thing I want to add. So traditionally, when we talk about self-control, self-regulation, there's this very simplistic model that it consists of two parts. So we have like impulses that we need to control, right? Like we want to have another glass of wine in the evening, even though we know we have an important project to do in the next day. And then there are these higher cognitive processes, more in the frontal dorsolateral regions, that are kind of controlling those impulses, right? Those values. Or those emotional processes. And now really the idea, what if we can change really, like Michael also already said, change the value of those behaviors. Instead of trying to control ourselves, we can learn that our behavior of drinking too much wine in the evening is actually not as rewarding as we thought, by simply being mindful, by being aware. So this is one thing I would contribute.
So I suppose where my research and kind of relevant research and empathy speaks to this about a bit is the extent to which we value the emotions and perspectives of other people. And I think it's important for us to realize that we all have propensities to which we do this, but also profound abilities to do it. So empathy can certainly be costly, it can be effortful, it can be a negative feeling sometimes to interact with someone else who's having a negative emotion. But there's also value in it if we see that we can increase the efficiency of our communication, our ability to work better with other individuals, and also realize it's something we can change to an extent if we try to upregulate the extent to which we're kind of understanding the perspectives of others and also their emotions.
Sure, it's a very interesting question, very fundamental, I think, and it's interesting to see how like we can all translate this through our different lenses of the kinds of things we're focusing on. But I think ultimately, when we're talking about value and what factors influence like how people value different kinds of experiences, how people construct value, like we're talking about something very fundamental. Like we end up talking about all of behavior, right? So there's, you know, where does this value come from? I think definitely it's kind of echoing a lot of what Vera said. Like a lot of the kind of, one of the profound insights of like neuroscience of affective processes in the past several years is that these kinds of you know, experiences, how we value something in the world, like whether this is important to us or whether that's important to us, can be constructed on the fly and can be changed, right? Like you can change that based on your current goals in a particular context, right? And so that intersects very clearly with a lot of the kinds of things I've thought about in terms of where emotions come from. How can we change our emotions? And I think also like we end up talking a lot about behavior change, right? Because the question is not just like, you know, are people valuing this or not? It's like, how can we get people to change what they value? How can we make it more in line with like some other values, or more in line with, how can we get their behavior to align better with their own long-term values, these kinds of things. So it ends up becoming a very, again, tricky and fundamental question about like, where does behavior come from? How can that change?
Sure. So Bruce, why don't you keep the mic for now, and based on your expertise, especially around, you know, messaging and communication, you know, how can knowledge from neuroscience help to more optimally, you know, change the goals and the mindsets of people so that they can receive messaging, feedback, even if it's not all positive, and, you know, and sort of deliver more effective behavioral change?
Great. I think this panel is well positioned to answer this question, because as academics, we study these kinds of things like feedback, but like we're also experts in learning how to respond to rejection, because that's a ubiquitous thing in our chosen occupation. So again, my training is in affective science and emotion. I would really take this question through that lens. So, you know, emotions, are very important, right? Like emotions are the things that give color and meaning to our lives. And so, you know, what is an emotion? An emotion is defined as the response we have to some stimulus or event in the world. That could be anything. It could be like feedback on an evaluation. It could be a comment that someone made to you in a meeting. And then the next thing you do is you appraise or interpret the meaning of that event in light of your goals, needs, wants, motivations, and that gives rise to an emotional response. That's the kind of current consensus model of how emotion works. And that emotional response includes different things, certainly changes in how I feel, also changes in my behavior, what I'm doing now, how I'm expressing myself, and also changes in my underlying physiology, like is my heart pounding, is my skin crawling right now, et cetera. So in terms of how to get people to respond more adaptively to feedback, messaging, this kinds of thing, well, what we know about those appraisals from the sort of the neuroscience and psychology of this area is that they can unfold very rapidly, like within fractions of a second. And they're based in part on evolutionarily kind of prepared ways of understanding or interpreting the meaning of the world. But we can also learn these patterns of interpretation. And importantly, this area of emotion regulation research that I focus on really has shown that like people can deliberately take control of how these appraisals are unfolding to change them. One of the most powerful tools that people have for changing their emotional responses and their behavior is this strategy that's called cognitive reappraisal, which essentially entails, you know, changing the way you interpret the meaning of some event in your that's occurring in order to change how you respond to it. So I think that, you know, to make that kind of more concrete, you can imagine like an event like a public speaking engagement, right? Like for many people, like the common way to appraise this is like a kind of ambiguous threat. Like I'm talking about these things, but like the people are evaluating me, like do they really understand what I'm talking about, or do they think it's valuable, right? But like instead of interpreting it that way, instead you can interpret it as like, wow, like what an amazing opportunity to showcase my knowledge and skills, right? Like, so if you can like flip that mental switch, you can put yourself on a better trajectory, right, as an individual. And as a manager, you can also try to model and shape these abilities in the people that you're coaching, managing, et cetera. I don't want to get too far afield from the question, but that's certainly like how I would approach this kind of idea.
Sure, go ahead.
yeah, so this also, of course, taps into the whole growth mindset and fixed mindset idea, right? That if people believe that their intelligence and skills are fixed, then they will appraise the feedback by the manager or similar as, okay, this means I am stupid and I basically, this is over. So of course, we have to now think about how can we induce a growth mindset in people and how can neuroscience contribute to this. I would say that because we know that the brain is constantly still changing, making new connections, even some new neurons are built in certain areas of the brain or born. So if people know this, and especially also the leaders are really aware of the fact that we can always develop at all stages of our lives into old age, then this can help also to communicate that to the employee, for example, in a feedback conversation, right? That you also set the stage by having a common goal and inducing this mindset of cooperation, right? That you are really saying, okay, we have the goal here together that we will still work together for the next 5 years or something, or to prepare you for your next endeavor after this. So I just have some ideas what I could tell you today, what you could still improve on to be even greater. Yeah, so that's just another point about this.
Great. Kristin, since you've studied, I think, both extreme pathological selflessness as well as extreme pathological selfishness, are there insights from the neuroscience around these sort of character traits that we can learn from the extremes, but also like how best to use what we know from neuroscience to sort of better understand how to put people into a framework where they may be, more compassionate or, able to put some of their own self-needs in front, but also some sort of organizational ones.
Sure. So I'd say the probably extremes of empathy might be rather trait-based, but in the more normal variation of empathy, there's a lot of room to kind of grow and expand beyond what we might tend to do in a given situation. So one relevant study that me and my colleagues have done, so we've done an empathy for pain study very similar to what Michael presented before. So we're actually putting people in some pain in the scanner. We're squishing their thumbnails. I actually had this done to myself as well. It's not too bad, but it is pretty unpleasant. So they're having that experience. They're also seeing a stranger experience this exact same pain outside the scanner via a live video feed. And the participants were particularly interested in this study were altruistic kidney donors. So these are people who have given one of their kidneys to a total stranger. This is kind of our definition of highly empathic individuals. And at baseline, they do show more neural similarity for both fear and pain with that other person. So their brain activation in this pain network, it's looking very similar when they're experiencing pain themselves, but also when they're simply observing someone else in pain. But we found when we give a very simple prompt to the controls in our study, which was just people who haven't donated a kidney, so everyone else, including myself, their brain activation actually starts to look more similar. So it starts to approach the similarity degree that we're seeing in these highly altruistic individuals. And this was a very simple prompt. It was just try to think and feel kind of with that person that you're seeing who's having a similar experience. So just realizing, I think the first step is realizing that we can improve our empathy in a given situation and also over time. Just by very simply taking a moment to think, what is this person thinking and feeling? How is their perspective, their life experience different than mine? And how can that inform how I'm approaching this situation? Also, as Michael brought up before, being able to interact with someone kind of in person, so you can get their vocal cues, their body language, their emotional expressions. We're better able to communicate that way, kind of be more cooperative, be more on the same page, more efficient in working together. It's when we're separated over email or text, it's very hard to convey emotion in that way properly. It's not quite the back and forth of natural conversation that kind of humans are most adapted to. So I'd say those are two kind of major ways to try to improve our cooperation and also our empathy with others. And what we see in these highly altruistic individuals with the more similarity for the pain experience, also a more reactive and also larger amygdala when responding to fear in others, that tends to be the opposite of what we see in highly psychopathic individuals, for example. So these are people who are by trait, very low in empathy for other individuals. So we do seem to be seeing kind of two ends of an empathic continuum, and it'd be the case that most of us are kind of somewhere in between and can move the dial a little bit in either direction. That's a very new area of research. I know there's a couple of groups who are trying to train empathy kind of like a muscle to see if we can improve it over time in a more long-term way. But I think we're not quite there with the brain research yet, but that's kind of the next major area of empathy research with the brain.
So I'll just address one more question, and then we'll open the floor to you guys, being aware of time. So Vera, how can we foster more of an intrinsic motivation versus an extrinsic? Like, how can we make the motivations come from within instead of from the environment itself? What are some of the insights that you can shed on that?
Yeah, this relates to what I said at my first contribution. So basically, you might be aware of the self-determination theory by Ryan and Dickey, who have specified different levels of being extrinsically motivated, then moving over to being kind of intrinsically motivated, like you're injecting the motivations and you're making the external ones your own. So you identify with the goals of your company, for example. And then at some point, the really high end of intrinsic motivation is when you're really enjoying the contributing, and you're really in the flow and curiously exploring creative ideas. So this is related to what I said before. As I said, that intrinsically motivated behavior feels good in itself, right? If our behavior is aligned with our real, authentic goals, then this feels good. But we are often not really aware of that because we are on autopilot and we are just responding to often our fears, etc. of, okay, oh my God, I need to earn money, etc. I have to make an impression on my boss or something like this. And that is actually a very stressful experience and brings our brain in a constant fear mode. So again, the key, in my opinion, is awareness. So it could be trained by doing a bit of meditation every day, even if it's just 10 minutes. But research has shown that actually informal awareness training can also be very effective. So you don't necessarily have to do the formal meditation practice, but you could also just learn to be more mindful, more aware in everyday life, and just to pay attention, like, what does it feel like what I'm doing right now? Like, I'm forcing myself to do something at work and actually I'm feeling really bad the whole time. I really have to struggle with myself. I'm forcing myself. Then maybe stop and ask yourself, is this then really what is needed right now? Is this really what I should be doing right now? Or do I have another project in mind that would be so amazing, would align so much with my values? And I could talk to my boss about this, for example, if this is gonna be something that I could move forward and I would be much more productive in and feel much better with. So I think we just have to learn to listen to our inner compass and to this subjective value system in the brain so that we can kind of reprogram the value system in our brain, or reprogram is the wrong way, just paying better attention to what is really rewarding to us, which is things that align with our true authentic goals and being good with other people, typically.
All right, so we'll open up the floor. I think there's a roving mic somewhere.
So I have a couple of reactions and then a couple of thoughts about how this plays out in the middle of dramatic, tumultuous change kind of events. And I'm thinking kind of in the eye of the storm, much as your primates were in the sense of a hurricane. But the one thing I want to say, I just appreciate so much the multidisciplinary view of this. There's a very, very old book chapter that was put on my desk my first day of work, and it's Henry Murray's Introductions, Explorations in Personality. The introductory chapter of that, you should read that, because way back when somebody said, we ought to be pooling our perspectives on this as a way of going deeper. I also wish you all had been around about 20 years ago when I was working with the Canadian government while it was downsizing by a third, and they were having to let go of their whole value system of what public service meant. And these were senior leaders charged with implementing something that A, they didn't, it was uncertain, and B, they hated what they could see of it. And so as you're talking just now about how wonderful it is to be able to be self-aware in those moments and recognize how you're getting in your own way or how there might be value on the other side while you're still entrenched in who you think you are. What is the value then of being able to do that out loud in front of each other in those moments so that collectively you can start to move forward? And how much does that build empathy? I mean, we learned all those things the hard way, but the difficult task is unmasking in those moments where everybody's under stress and in great fear, and creating a safe space to do that. You talk about being disconnected by phone or whatever. What organization usually is ready in those moments, those powerful inflection moments where you're under great stress as an organization and have no idea how you're going to get through it? Which organizations are willing to say, we're going to set aside time to collectively come together, be vulnerable, express those deepest thoughts about how we're not able to do this? So we literally had people telling those stories to each other. What does it feel like to be me in this moment? And how am I getting in my own way? The level of empathy and connection, that word keeps coming up today, the level of empathy and connection that came out of those very difficult emotional weeks that we spent with people literally started to bring those primates together like they were on those primates, us, together in one of those moments and sustain it over time, but it took a powerful unmasking. I'd love to know what went on in the brains during those sessions where people were able to unmask and be vulnerable in front of each other, and actually they united in hating us, the staff, for putting them in those moments where they had to reflect in that way out loud with each other. And they sort of united in hating us, which was, and they came around by the end of the week. They liked us, but this is all, I mean,
But you're Canadian, you're likable, right?
Yeah, but well, it was a lot about modeling vulnerability yourself,
Yeah.
because our own stories came out in that week. So that's the other word I would add to this, is that in addition to whatever patterns you have personality-wise, everybody has a story. And everybody, whatever your own story is heightened in those stressful moments. So however locked in you are, you're probably more locked in those moments. Anyway, I just think this whole project is fascinating, and I would have loved to have all your brains come work on our brains while we were trying to do this work. Because it was like a 4-year project where we were involved with about 2,500 senior level people in that moment.
Just want to can I briefly respond to that? I feel qualified because I'm also Canadian, so I feel. But yeah, I mean, I just want to thank you for sharing those insights and that story, like that, that scenario that you so like vividly describe really does kind of get to the heart of a lot of things we're talking about here. And I think that it's so important, like in terms of, like, in the changing nature of the current economy, like we have like a lot of the things that we're talking about kind of fall under the category of quote unquote soft skills, like what have been considered soft skills in the past. So these are things like negotiating, persuading people, managing emotions, like leadership. All these kinds of things are so important across a wide variety of careers, right? especially in times of like tumultuous change, like you described. And they'll continue to be even more important in the future, right? As like these are going to, any job where you interact with or manage people, right? Those are the jobs that are hard to automate. Those are the high-paying jobs, right? And these skills are incredibly important in these tumultuous change. And now it's like with the changing economy, basically we have this kind of tumultuous change across a variety of industries happening all the time, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, so definitely like, for sure the kinds of things we're talking about, we're trying to speak to these kinds of scenarios. And the question you kind of like are pointing to is kind of like, how do we promote this culture where, you know, people can come together in this way and like get through this kind of together? And I don't know that we have the answers, right? But certainly, like I'm echoing a lot of the things that Michael talked about, that Vera has mentioned. Like there are definitely some factors that are really important, right? One is like having a strong social network, perceived social support. Like if you feel like you have someone that you can go to when you're going through a crisis, like outside of work or at work, that's a huge factor predicting well-being, right? That is huge. You know, like if you feel like your team has your back, your boss is going to back you up, like you have this sense of safety, then you can perform at a higher level. You can navigate these challenges more effectively. Yeah, I mean, so again, yeah, thank you for that. And that's as a Canadian, that's my perspective.
I think one of the most interesting things about the Google Teams study that came out, right, was that they had all of the data analytics behind, you know, how to mix up teams, and single-handedly, right, the answer that they came up with was what they termed psychological safety, but what turned out to be about trust, right? And what they found, right, is that when teams trusted each other, right? They may not have security, right? They may not know that they're going to have their job the next day. Maybe that's not as important as trust. But they were willing to take risks and expose themselves and innovate and come up with new ideas and strategies. And I think that's a take-home message that I have employed, you know, day to day in my own work as a manager and as a team member. And I think, you know, it's something to be mindful of. Now, how do you build trust? Well, we have seen demonstrations of you know, a number of sort of easy solutions for helping to build that. But I think what you can see is that the moment that distrust enters the room, then things really do fall apart. Okay, next question.
Thank you all for being here. Very, very quick comment and then a question. First of all, I was grateful to learn the term cognitive reappraisal. I feel like I apparently cognitively reappraised or taught that to my 16-year-old daughter last night, and I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. So I was really glad to know that. My question is this, and it stems from the portion of the presentation that had to do with the hurricane coming, and there is something I'm encountering as rather vogue today around trauma-informed fill in the blank. I went to a conference recently on trauma-informed leadership development, and I'm curious about how an individual's trauma, and I'm taking this out of the context of organizational, but how an individual's trauma at any point in their life, you know, current or past, impacts their ability to tap into that empathy or to do these skills, to activate these skills that you're describing, the mindfulness, the presence, the emotional empathy. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
I wouldn't say I have vast expertise with that, but I think it tends to be the case that people who have experienced some trauma, they actually tend to be better empathizers to an extent, perhaps because they have a little bit more personal experience to draw from. But I think that's something we can that kind of heightened natural sort of empathy is something we can all work towards as well. Kind of how we tend to engage in empathy, we can kind of grow from that and increase it. Whether that's kind of being very conscious about it, like trying to think more, what is this person feeling, what's their perspective, but also trying to make that easier for ourselves in the situation, so trying to interact more face-to-face as opposed to over email, for example.
Yeah, I think people who have experienced trauma are kind of forced to look into their own subjective lives, right? Like, because it just has a lot of consequences for well-being, so they kind of are more likely to learn these skills like awareness and dealing with emotions effectively, etc., which is maybe one reason why it's even good for a coach, for example, if they have been through hardship themselves, right, and have experienced also some difficulties, so that they can really empathize with the clients. So
one related question, I guess, is in terms of the quality versus quantity. You've talked about the brain's growing in terms of the number of relationships, as well as, I don't know how you measure this, but the depth of the relationship. So I have some clients who would describe themselves as introverts, and if the idea is you have to, have a few close relationships to navigate the company and see what you need to get done, and very skeptical of people who are seemingly extroverts and maybe more superficial relationships.
Yes.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So this is, I think, a really important question. The data on monkeys is very clear, and I think it echoes more or less the aggregate understanding we have for people, which is that those are two routes to the same good outcome, which is you can have like one or a couple of really tight, deep relationships, or you can have lots of relationships, right, that may be a little bit more superficial. But in either case, you're bringing to yourself enough social support and enough social stimulation to have the same kind of effect. So for monkeys, both routes lead to better success and longevity and greater health. And I think the data is aligned with that for humans, but maybe you guys know a little bit better. No?
Well, I think there's no evidence for introverts having a decreased social brain network, right? So I think we have to decouple some of the ideas around what introversion and extroversion means, right? Just you don't have to be the life of the party, but your social circle can still be incredibly important to you, but you need other time, right? And I think that's been pretty clearly shown from the neuroscience perspective, is that like as a personality trait, if you want to say that that's a personality trait, it's not predictive of a decrease in social cognition.
I think that where I spoke a little bit about, I think I did, maybe I didn't, but there's really amazing epidemiological data now that shows that people who feel lonely, so it's the sense of the quality, it's the feeling of lonely. It's not necessarily that if you are alone, but you choose to be alone, that's different from feeling lonely. But feeling lonely is associated with actual physical pain and increased morbidity and illness, and over a lifetime, that's a health burden that's equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. But that's for those people who, like most people, want to be with other people, right? And therefore feel deprived of something that feels necessary for them. But there are people who are perfectly happy to be alone. And maybe they're just a little bit different. We don't, I think, understand how. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing for them. It's not like they're not going to live as long or something like that.
I'm curious to know if anybody has studied the neuroscience about first impressions, because a lot of times there is an immediate reaction to people in any sort of group dynamic or in an interview dynamic for recruiting. So, for example, did any of your monkeys detest each other upon first meeting or really bond upon first meeting? And what could be behind that?
Yeah, I don't, we have never studied first impressions in monkeys. But there is a sense in which, and I think there's neuroscience on this in humans, that we do form first impressions of things like trustworthiness, and those are pretty consistent across people. There are some kinds of indicators that our brains attend to, and in fact, monkeys prefer to look at human faces that have been judged as more trustworthy by other humans. So the signals I think are pretty, they're pretty widespread and probably pretty ancient that we respond to. I don't know if you guys had anything else to say on that.
Well, Bruce, your lab does some exercises on intimacy building, best friends, and
I usually don't participate in this. I guess that is related, though, yeah. I mean, certainly there's a large social psychology literature on impression formation. People will rapidly make like very confident like appraisals of other people's personality, trustworthiness, dominance, like extroversion, et cetera, just based on very thin slices, just even like a picture of their face or a small video of them. Those are consistent from person to person, so there is definitely something about the what they're responding to that evokes that reaction. Whether those are accurate is like a different question. Sometimes they can be, sometimes they'll be dramatically inaccurate. And then there is also neuroscience research too in terms of like how those kinds of things are related to brain representations. A friend of mine actually has done a study where they looked at formation of a social network, not of monkeys, but of college students in a socialist summer camp who initially didn't know each other at all, or they had very minimal experience with each other, but they got to know each other over the 6 weeks of this camp. And he showed actually that you could scan their brains at the initial period, like before they had any time to interact, and predict which friendships would form over the next 6 weeks, just so based on impressions, like very thin sliced judgments apparent in like perceiving a face. You can predict who will become friends to above chance accuracy, and more accurately with the brain activity than with their behavioral responses in that case. So definitely there's a literature on that.
Maybe as a little outlook for the next time we're here, perhaps. We are also now conducting a study, Michael and I, and some others, where we will actually induce different ways of looking at people that you've never met before. So there's normally or often when we see other people, we categorize them immediately, like, right, this is like a successful manager, or this is like a poor woman, or something like this. And then we just put them in these categories, and our brain just doesn't even really process them anymore. It just like, this is this. And then to induce a different type of perception, where we use an exercise from nonviolent communication, where people are just told some sentences about just telling them, hey, look at this being and contemplate that this person has been through pain and fear, for example, like you have, or that this person has wishes and desires like you. And just by making this mindset switch, we might induce like a strong connectedness, and there's no longer this first impression, but you were really in connection with someone and perceiving in each moment this person. So next time maybe we can tell you about the results of this.
In conclusion, I mean, I think we're right at the beginning, right, of thinking about where some of the knowledge can transfer into applications. We are here as partners of AIIR obviously we don't have boundless amounts of time to answer emails, but maybe we can respond, over time. But to your questions, to some of the insights that you have, we are open to, and the kinds of things that are emerging that you think perhaps we might be able to provide, some guidance from a neuroscientific perspective. And likewise, right, what we're hoping for is for you to influence the kinds of science that we do, the kinds of experimentation that we can do to design more effective practice, right, and take neuroscience out of the lab and into the wild. So.